In the early months of 1982, a small British electronics company prepared to release a product that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of personal computing in the United Kingdom and beyond. The Sinclair ZX Spectrum, a modest machine with a rubber keyboard and a price tag of just £125 for the basic model, would become more than a computer. It would become a cultural phenomenon, a gateway to digital creativity, and the foundation of an entire generation's relationship with technology. The landscape of home computing in the early 1980s was sparse and forbidding. Computers were expensive, mysterious devices that belonged in corporate offices or university laboratories. The average person had little reason to own one and even less understanding of what they might do with it. Yet beneath this surface, a hunger was growing. Science fiction had promised a future of intelligent machines and digital wonders. Television shows depicted computers as powerful tools that could solve complex problems in seconds. The public was ready, but the technology had not yet met them at an accessible price point. This is where Clive Sinclair entered the picture. A self-taught engineer and entrepreneur with a gift for miniaturization and cost reduction, Sinclair had already proven that affordable electronics could reach mass markets. His earlier ventures into pocket calculators and digital watches had demonstrated both his technical ingenuity and his understanding of consumer desire. By the late 1970s, Sinclair had turned his attention to the emerging field of personal computers, convinced that the same principles of affordability and accessibility could democratize computing itself. The Sinclair ZX Spectrum did not emerge from a vacuum. It was the culmination of lessons learned, mistakes corrected, and ambitions refined through earlier products. Before the Spectrum, Sinclair Research had released the ZX80 in 1980, followed by the ZX81 in 1981. These machines were revolutionary in their own right, offering functional computers at prices that undercut competitors by orders of magnitude. The ZX81 in particular sold over 1.5 million units worldwide, proving that a mass market for home computers existed if the price was right. But these early machines had significant limitations. Their black and white displays, minimal memory, and membrane keyboards restricted what users could achieve. Games were rudimentary, graphics were basic. The user experience, while thrilling for early adopters, left much to be desired for those hoping to push creative boundaries. Sinclair and his team recognized these shortcomings. They understood that the next iteration needed to offer more, to inspire not just curiosity but genuine creativity and productivity. The ZX Spectrum would be that machine. The name itself carried meaning. Spectrum referred to the color capabilities that would set this computer apart from its monochrome predecessors. In an era when color television was becoming the standard in British homes, a computer that could display vibrant graphics on a family TV set held immediate appeal. The choice of name signaled ambition and possibility. It suggested a full range of experiences, a palette of digital potential waiting to be explored. The development of the ZX Spectrum took place in a modest facility in Cambridge, where Sinclair Research operated with a lean team and an ethos of efficiency. Clive Sinclair himself was deeply involved in the engineering decisions, pushing for cost reductions without sacrificing essential functionality. Every component was scrutinized. Every design choice was weighed against the twin imperatives of affordability and capability. The goal was not to create the most powerful computer on the market, but to create the most accessible one that still offered genuine creative potential. The team working on the Spectrum included some of the brightest minds in British electronics and design. Rick Dickinson, the industrial designer responsible for the machine's iconic appearance, understood that aesthetics mattered. The Spectrum needed to look modern, approachable, and appealing to families who might place it in their living rooms. The result was a sleek black case with a rainbow stripe across the lower right corner, a visual echo of the color capabilities within. The design became instantly recognizable and remained a design icon for decades. But design was only part of the equation. The technical architecture of the Spectrum required careful engineering to balance performance with cost. The choice of processor, memory configuration, graphics capabilities, and input methods all had to work within tight budgetary constraints, while still delivering an experience superior to the ZX81. This balancing act would define the Spectrum's strengths and its limitations, shaping both what it could do and what creative users would need to overcome. To understand the ZX Spectrum, one must first understand the machines that preceded it. The ZX80, released in February of 1980, was Clive Sinclair's first complete home computer. Priced at just under £100 as a kit or £120 fully assembled, it was the first personal computer available in the United Kingdom for less than £100. This pricing was revolutionary. While competitors like Apple and Commodore offered machines costing several times as much, the ZX80 brought computing within reach of hobbyists, students, and curious families. The ZX80 was built around the Zilog Z80 processor, an 8-bit CPU that had become popular in embedded systems and would continue to power Sinclair machines for years to come. With 1 kilobyte of RAM as standard, the ZX80 was severely limited by modern standards, but for its time and price, it represented remarkable value. Users could write simple programs in BASIC, perform calculations, and experiment with the fundamentals of programming. The machine displayed output on a television screen via RF modulator, eliminating the need for an expensive, dedicated monitor. However, the ZX80 had significant drawbacks. Its display would blank whenever the processor performed calculations, creating a flickering effect that made real-time gaming or animation nearly impossible. The membrane keyboard, while cost-effective, offered poor tactile feedback and was prone to errors. The machine's overall build quality was fragile, and its capabilities were limited even by the standards of early home computers. Yet despite these limitations, the ZX80 sold well, demonstrating that demand existed for affordable computing. Learning from the ZX80's reception, Sinclair Research quickly developed a successor. The ZX81, launched in March of 1981, addressed some of the earlier machine's shortcomings, while maintaining the aggressive pricing strategy that had proven successful. The ZX81 featured an improved display system that eliminated much of the flickering, thanks to a new slow mode that allowed the screen to remain stable during program execution. The price was even more attractive, dropping to just £69.95 for the kit version. The ZX81 became a phenomenon. It sold over 1.5 million units worldwide, making it one of the best-selling computers of its era. In the United States, it was marketed by Timex as the Timex Sinclair 1000, bringing Sinclair's vision to American homes. Schools began purchasing ZX81s to introduce students to programming. Magazines dedicated to the platform emerged, filled with program listings that readers could type in themselves. A community formed around the machine, sharing tips, tricks, and software. Yet the ZX81, for all its success, remained limited. Its monochrome display and minimal memory restricted what users could create. Games were simple, often text-based affairs or basic graphical representations. Sound was limited to a speaker that could only produce beeps of varying duration. The keyboard, while slightly improved from the ZX80, was still a membrane design that many users found frustrating for extended typing sessions. As the home computer market began to heat up in early 1982, Sinclair recognized that the next machine would need to offer substantially more. The competition was intensifying. Commodore had released the VIC-20, a color computer with sound capabilities and a more substantial keyboard, at a competitive price point. Acorn Computers, another British company, was developing the BBC Micro in partnership with the British Broadcasting Corporation, a machine that would become the standard in UK schools. In the United States, companies like Atari, Apple, and Texas Instruments were all vying for the home computer market. Sinclair needed to move quickly and decisively. The design philosophy for what would become the ZX Spectrum emerged from analyzing both the successes and failures of the ZX80 and ZX81. Users wanted color. They wanted better graphics. They wanted more memory to write more sophisticated programs and play more engaging games. They wanted sound that went beyond simple beeps. And crucially, they wanted all of this at a price that remained accessible to ordinary families. This was the challenge Sinclair set for his engineering team. Rick Dickinson's industrial design work on the Spectrum reflected a maturing understanding of how computers fit into domestic spaces. The ZX80 and ZX81 had looked like technical experiments, functional but austere. The Spectrum, by contrast, would look like a product designed for consumers. The black case with its rainbow stripe suggested both sophistication and playfulness. The slightly larger form factor accommodated a more substantial keyboard, though still using rubber keys rather than the mechanical switches found on more expensive machines. Every visual element was chosen to communicate value and capability. The technical specifications were equally carefully considered. The Spectrum would use the same Z80 processor as its predecessors, running at 3.5 MHz. This choice provided continuity with existing software and kept costs down while offering adequate performance for the types of applications expected on a home computer. The real advances would come in memory, graphics, and sound. The base model would offer 16 kilobytes of RAM, with a more expensive version offering 48 kilobytes. This was a quantum leap from the ZX81's 1 kilobyte standard configuration. For graphics, the Spectrum would feature a resolution of 256 by 192 pixels, with a palette of 8 colors, plus an additional 8 bright variants of those colors. This would enable colorful games, educational software, and creative applications that were simply impossible on earlier Sinclair machines. The color implementation was clever if limited. The Spectrum used a character cell-based color system, where colors were assigned to 8 by 8 pixel blocks, rather than individual pixels. This reduced memory requirements but created the infamous color clash effect that would become both a limitation and a characteristic signature of Spectrum software. Sound capabilities were provided by a simple beeper controlled directly by the processor. While not as sophisticated as dedicated sound chips in competing machines, creative programmers would eventually coax surprisingly complex audio from this simple system. The combination of color graphics, expanded memory, and basic sound capabilities position the Spectrum as a genuine multimedia platform, at least by the standards of 1982. The technical heart of the ZX Spectrum was the Zilog Z50A microprocessor, running at 3.5 MHz. The Z80 was a workhorse of early computing, found in everything from arcade machines to industrial control systems. Its 8-bit architecture and extensive instruction set made it popular with programmers, and its relatively low cost made it attractive to manufacturers. For Sinclair, the Z80 represented continuity. Software written for the ZX81 could potentially be adapted for the Spectrum with modifications. Programmers familiar with Z80 assembly language could immediately begin developing for the new platform. The memory configuration offered two tiers. The base model featured 16 kilobytes of RAM, which Sinclair positioned as adequate for learning programming and running simpler software. The 48 kilobyte model cost £175, £50 more than the base model, but this additional memory would prove crucial for serious game development and more complex applications. Both models included 16 kilobytes of ROM containing the Sinclair BASIC interpreter and essential system routines. The BASIC interpreter was central to the Spectrum's design philosophy. Sinclair BASIC was built into the machine, accessible immediately upon powering on. The language featured a unique keyword entry system where common commands could be entered with a single key press, rather than typing them out letter by letter. This system made programming faster and reduced typing errors, though it required users to memorize which keys corresponded to which commands. The rubber keyboard displayed these keywords in a color-coded scheme that helped users navigate the system. The graphics system was both the Spectrum's greatest strength and its most notable limitation. The display resolution of 256 pixels horizontally by 192 vertically was respectable for the time. The 8 basic colors, black, blue, red, magenta, green, cyan, yellow, and white, could each be displayed in normal or bright variants, giving a total palette of 16 colors, though only 2 colors could appear within any 8x8 pixel character cell. This color clash phenomenon would become infamous among Spectrum developers. When a sprite or game element moved across the screen, it could only use 2 colors within each 8x8 block it occupied. Careful sprite design and movement patterns could minimize the visual impact, but the limitation was fundamental to the hardware. Some developers embraced this as a creative challenge, designing games specifically to work within these constraints. Others found it frustrating, particularly when comparing the Spectrum to machines like the Commodore 64, which had dedicated sprite hardware that avoided such issues. The display system also introduced another quirk. The screen memory layout was not linear, meaning that consecutive bytes in memory did not correspond to consecutive pixels on screen. Instead, the memory was organized in a pattern that reduced the component count in the Spectrum's hardware design, another cost-saving measure. This made programming graphics more complex, as calculating the memory address for a particular pixel required understanding this non-intuitive layout. Experienced programmers learned to work with this efficiently, but it presented a barrier for beginners attempting to manipulate graphics directly. Sound on the Spectrum was produced by a single-bit output connected to a speaker. The processor could turn this output on and off at varying frequencies to produce different tones. While simple, this system allowed for beeps, clicks, and with clever programming, even rudimentary music. Some games would feature title screen music or simple sound effects. Programmers developed techniques to produce multi-channel sound by rapidly switching between different frequencies, creating the illusion of multiple simultaneous tones. The limitations fostered innovation, with developers finding ways to create atmospheric audio that enhanced the gaming experience. Input and output options were relatively straightforward. The Spectrum connected to a television via an RF modulator, allowing it to use the family TV as a display. This eliminated the need for a dedicated monitor, keeping costs down and making the computer more accessible. The machine included ports for loading and saving programs to cassette tape, a standard method for data storage on home computers of the era. An edge connector on the back of the unit allowed for expansion and peripherals, though the specific implementation would change across different Spectrum models. The keyboard, perhaps the most distinctive and controversial feature of the Spectrum, used rubber keys that compressed when pressed. Each key performed multiple functions depending on the mode in which modifier keys were held. The keyword entry system mentioned earlier meant that pressing a key in command mode might enter an entire basic keyword, while in text mode the same key would produce a letter. This multifunction approach maximized the utility of the limited number of keys, but required users to learn and remember the various combinations. Manufacturing the Spectrum presented its own challenges. Sinclair Research did not own manufacturing facilities. Instead, production was contracted to Timex Corporation's facility in Dundee, Scotland. This arrangement allowed Sinclair to scale production quickly without the capital investment required for a dedicated factory. However, it also meant that quality control and production capacity were partially outside Sinclair's direct oversight. In the early months after launch, demand would far outstrip supply, leading to significant waiting times for customers who had placed orders. The launch of the ZX Spectrum took place on April 23, 1982, at the Churchill Hotel in London. The presentation emphasized the machine's color capabilities, its expanded memory, and its competitive pricing. Sinclair positioned the Spectrum as a serious computer for education, programming, and entertainment, not merely a toy. The marketing materials showed families gathered around televisions, children learning to code, and vivid game graphics that promised a new era of home computing. Initial press reaction was largely positive, though reviewers noted the rubber keyboard as a point of contention. Technology journalists appreciated the value proposition and the significant improvements over the ZX81. The color graphics were particularly praised, as were the expanded programming capabilities afforded by the additional memory. Some reviews expressed skepticism about the keyboard and questioned whether serious programming work could be done on such a machine, but most acknowledged that at the price point these were acceptable compromises. Pre-orders began flooding in even before the official launch. Sinclair's existing customer base from the ZX81 provided a ready market of enthusiasts eager to upgrade. Schools and educational institutions seeing the potential for teaching programming and computer literacy placed bulk orders. Parents, hoping to prepare their children for a computerized future, added their names to the waiting lists. Within months, Sinclair Research was struggling to fulfill the massive demand. The pricing strategy proved to be exactly right for the market conditions of 1982. The 16 kilobyte model, at £125, was within reach for middle-class families, particularly when purchased on installment plans that some retailers offered. The 48 kilobyte model at £175 was still significantly cheaper than most competitors, making it attractive to those who wanted maximum capability without spending hundreds or thousands of pounds on imported American machines. By the end of 1982, the Spectrum was well on its way to becoming the dominant home computer in the United Kingdom. Sales figures climbed steadily as production ramped up. Software developers, seeing the size of the installed base, began creating programs specifically for the platform. A ecosystem was forming, driven by the combination of affordable hardware, accessible programming tools, and a growing community of users who shared a common platform. The commercial success of the ZX Spectrum exceeded even Sinclair's optimistic projections. Within the first year, over 200,000 units were sold in the United Kingdom alone. By the end of its production run, the various Spectrum models would sell over 5 million units worldwide, making it one of the best-selling British computers of all time. In the UK market specifically, the Spectrum achieved a dominant position, outselling competitors and becoming the de facto standard home computer for much of the 1980s. The reception among actual users was enthusiastic if mixed in some specifics. Owners loved the color graphics and the ability to play more sophisticated games than had been possible on the ZX81. The expanded memory opened up creative possibilities that felt genuinely transformative. Many users recall the excitement of first seeing color graphics on their television screens, the sense that they were witnessing the future arrive in their living rooms. These emotional connections to the machine would persist for decades. However, the rubber keyboard remained a source of frustration for many. Touch typing was nearly impossible, and extended programming sessions could leave fingers sore. The keys would sometimes fail to register presses, or would register multiple presses from a single touch. Third-party manufacturers quickly identified this pain point and began offering replacement keyboards with more traditional key switches, though these aftermarket modifications voided warranties and required technical skill to install. The color clash issue also became apparent as users began developing and playing games. While some developers worked around the limitation cleverly, others produced software that suffered from distracting visual artifacts. Players learned to accept this as part of the Spectrum experience, though debates raged in computer magazines about whether the hardware design was flawed or simply required more thoughtful programming. Some argued that the limitation encouraged creativity, forcing developers to think carefully about visual design. Others saw it as an unnecessary constraint that compromised the user experience. Loading software from cassette tape introduced another challenge that would become deeply embedded in Spectrum culture. Programs were recorded as audio signals on standard cassette tapes. To load a program, users would connect a cassette player to the Spectrum, type load followed by the program name, and press play on the tape deck. The loading process produced a distinctive screeching sound and could take several minutes for larger programs. Failed loads due to tape degradation, incorrect volume levels, or other technical issues were common, leading to frustration and the need to restart the process. Yet this loading process also became part of the ritual of Spectrum ownership. The waiting time, the anticipation as the border colors flashed indicating data was being read, and the moment when the program finally loaded and ran became shared experiences across millions of users. Magazine covers would feature colorful screenshots of new games, and users would discuss loading times and techniques for improving reliability. The cassette format, despite its limitations, kept software prices low and made distribution accessible to small publishers and bedroom programmers. Competition in the home computer market intensified throughout 1982 and 1983. The Commodore 64, released in mid-1982, offered superior sound and graphics capabilities through dedicated chips, along with a full-sized keyboard. In the United States and some other markets, the C64 would dominate, but in the UK, the Spectrum's early lead and lower price gave it a strong position. The BBC Micro, while technically impressive and favoured in educational settings, cost significantly more than the Spectrum, limiting its penetration into homes. Acorn's BBC Micro deserves particular mention as it represented a different approach to home computing in Britain. Backed by the British Broadcasting Corporation, and designed with education in mind, the BBC Micro was a robust, well-engineered machine with excellent documentation and strong institutional support. Many UK schools adopted it as their standard computer. However, at around £400 for the basic model, it was beyond the budget of many families. The Spectrum filled the gap, offering an affordable home computer that students could use to practice what they learned on BBC Micros at school. The Amstrad CPC series, which would arrive in 1984, presented another UK competitor. Amstrad's machines included a monitor and cassette or disk drive in an all-in-one package, with pricing competitive to the Spectrum. By the time Amstrad entered the market, however, the Spectrum had already established a substantial installed base and software library. The competition drove innovation and kept prices in check, benefiting consumers even as it created challenges for manufacturers. Sinclair Research faced production and quality control challenges as demand surged. The Timex manufacturing arrangement, while allowing rapid scaling, sometimes resulted in units with defects or inconsistencies. Stories circulated of machines arriving with keys that didn't work properly, or with hardware faults that required warranty service. Sinclair's customer service struggled to keep pace with the volume of inquiries and complaints. For a time, the company's reputation suffered, though the fundamental appeal of the product and its competitive pricing allowed it to weather these difficulties. The user community began self-organizing to address some of these issues. Computer clubs formed in towns and cities across the UK, where Spectrum owners could meet, share programs, troubleshoot problems, and learn from more experienced users. These clubs became social institutions, particularly important for young people interested in computing, who might not have peers at school who shared their enthusiasm. The clubs fostered a sense of belonging and collective identity around the Spectrum platform. By the end of 1983, the ZX Spectrum had firmly established itself as a cultural phenomenon. It was not merely a product, but a symbol of technological democratization. Families who had never owned a computer now had one in their homes. Children were learning to program before they reached secondary school. The foundation was being laid for what would become one of the most vibrant and creative software development communities in computing history. The ZX Spectrum arrived at a moment when personal computing was still new enough that the barriers to entry for software development were remarkably low. Unlike modern systems with their complex development environments and professional standards, the Spectrum presented an invitation. Turn it on, and you were immediately in BASIC, ready to program. The built-in language, the accessible documentation, and the culture of sharing and learning meant that anyone with curiosity and persistence could create software. This accessibility gave rise to what became known as bedroom coders, a generation of young programmers who created commercial software from their homes, often as teenagers. Without need for expensive equipment, formal training, or corporate infrastructure, these individuals could write a game, duplicate it onto cassettes, design simple cover art, and sell it through mail order or local shops. Some became remarkably successful, launching careers and even founding companies that would become significant players in the gaming industry. The economics of Spectrum software publishing were favorable to small-scale operations. A teenager with a Spectrum, a hi-fi system for tape duplication, and some artistic skill could produce a marketable product. Early games sold for as little as £2 or £3, making them affordable to the same young audience that was creating them. This created a virtuous cycle where kids bought games, learned from them, created their own, and sold those in turn. The industry was genuinely democratized in a way that would be difficult to replicate in later eras. Computer magazines played a crucial role in this ecosystem. Publications like your Sinclair User, Crash, and others provided news, reviews, programming tutorials, and most importantly, program listings. These magazines would print the basic code for complete programs, sometimes spanning dozens of pages. Readers would painstakingly type these listings into their Spectrums, debugging any typos they had made, and eventually run the programs. This process taught programming through osmosis, as users began to understand how the code worked and started modifying it to suit their preferences. The listing culture extended beyond magazines. Users would photocopy programs from library books, share handwritten code on notebook paper, and type in programs from friends. Before widespread internet access, this manual sharing of code was how knowledge spread. The experience of typing in a long program, fixing the inevitable bugs, and finally seeing it run successfully was formative for countless programmers. It taught patience, attention to detail, and the fundamentals of how software was constructed. Type-in games and utilities ranged from simple to surprisingly sophisticated. Some were educational, teaching mathematics or spelling through interactive quizzes. Others were games, from simple action titles to text adventures. Still others were utilities, programs that extended the Spectrum's capabilities or helped users manage their tape collections. The quality varied wildly, but each program represented someone's effort and creativity, and the act of typing it in created a connection between the original programmer and the user. As users became more proficient, many moved beyond BASIC to assembly language programming. The Z80 processor's instruction set, while complex, was well documented and learnable. Assembly language offered far greater control over the hardware and significantly better performance than BASIC. Games written in assembly could feature smooth scrolling, faster action, and more sophisticated graphics. Books and magazine articles taught assembly programming, and users would graduate from simple basic programs to complex assembly language projects. The bedroom coding phenomenon produced several notable success stories. Matthew Smith created Manic Miner at age 17, a platformer that would become one of the most iconic Spectrum games. The Oliver twins, Philip and Andrew Oliver, began their careers as teenage Spectrum programmers and went on to create the Dizzy series of adventure games. These and many other young developers proved that age and formal education were not barriers to creating commercially successful software. The Spectrum era demonstrated that talent, creativity, and determination could triumph. Software houses began to emerge, some started by bedroom coders who had outgrown their home operations, others founded by entrepreneurs recognizing the opportunity. Companies like Ultimate Play the Game, which would later become Rare, gained legendary status for their technically impressive and visually stunning games. Codemasters, founded by the Darling brothers, became known for budget games that still offered quality gameplay. Ocean Software, US Gold, Elite Systems, and many others competed to release the next hit title. The distribution model for Spectrum software was as diverse as the software itself. High street retailers like W.H. Smith and Boots began stocking computer games alongside books and magazines. Specialist computer shops carried extensive catalogues of titles. Mail-order companies advertised in magazines, offering dozens or hundreds of games sent on cassette through the post. Some pubs and corner shops would have a rotating rack of budget titles priced at £1.99. This accessibility meant games were impulse purchases, affordable to kids with pocket money. Piracy was rampant, facilitated by the ease of copying cassette tapes. Users would borrow games from friends and duplicate them onto blank tapes. Some saw this as harmless sharing, while software publishers viewed it as theft that undermined their ability to profit from their work. Copy protection schemes were developed, employing techniques like non-standard tape formats, or requiring users to enter codes from printed materials included with the original game. These measures met with varying success, and the arms race between copy protection and crackers continued throughout the Spectrum's commercial lifespan. Despite piracy concerns, the software industry thrived. The sheer size of the Spectrum installed base meant that even with significant piracy, successful games could sell tens or hundreds of thousands of legitimate copies. Hit titles became cultural touchstones, discussed in playgrounds and featured in magazines. The competitive market drove innovation, as developers sought to create the next breakthrough that would capture attention and sales. The result was a constantly evolving library of software that kept the platform vibrant and relevant. Gaming on the ZX Spectrum became the platform's defining application. While Sinclair had positioned the machine for education and productivity, it was games that captured the public imagination and drove much of the software development. The Spectrum's color graphics and sound capabilities, limited though they were, enabled game experiences that felt genuinely engaging and entertaining. From platformers to shooters, adventures to simulations, the breadth of the Spectrum game library was remarkable. Manic Miner, released in 1983, exemplified the creative heights Spectrum gaming could reach. Matthew Smith's platform game featured colourful graphics, memorable music thanks to clever use of the beeper, and challenging gameplay across 20 levels. Players controlled Miner Willy through caverns filled with obstacles and enemies, collecting keys to progress. The game's personality, from its surreal level themes to its humorous game over screens, made it more than just a technical achievement. It was a work of digital art that resonated with players. The success of Manic Miner led to a sequel, Set Willy, which expanded the concept into a massive mansion with dozens of interconnected rooms. The game was even more ambitious, though it famously shipped with bugs that made it impossible to complete without applying a patch published in magazines. This incident itself became part of Spectrum lore, illustrating both the rapid development cycles of the era and the collaborative relationship between developers and users. Players would share solutions to bugs and techniques for progressing, creating a collective problem-solving culture. The ultimate play. The game titles represented some of the most technically impressive work on the Spectrum. Games like Saber Wolf, Night Law, and Alien 8 featured advanced graphics techniques, including isometric views that created a pseudo-three-dimensional appearance. The company cultivated an aura of mystery, with founders Tim and Chris Stamper rarely giving interviews. Their games were eagerly anticipated events, often selling on reputation alone. The Ultimate Catalogue demonstrated that the Spectrum, in skilled hands, could produce software that rivaled or exceeded what was available on competing platforms. Arcade conversions were another major category. Games like Pac-Man, Space Invaders, and later more sophisticated titles were adapted for the Spectrum. The quality of these conversions varied widely. Some were faithful translations that captured the spirit of the originals despite hardware limitations. Others were poor approximations that disappointed players familiar with the arcade versions. As Spectrum programmers became more skilled, the quality of arcade ports generally improved, with titles like R-Type showcasing what could be achieved. Text adventures found a natural home on the Spectrum. These games, which describe locations and events through text and accepted typed commands from players, required minimal graphics and played to the Spectrum's strengths. British companies like Level 9 Computing and Melbourne House produced sophisticated adventures with complex parsers and engaging narratives. The Hobbit, an adaptation of Tolkien's novel, became particularly popular. These games offered hours of gameplay and challenged players' problem-solving and lateral thinking skills. The Dizzy series, created by the Oliver twins, represented a uniquely British take on platform adventure gameplay. Players controlled Dizzy, an anthropomorphic egg character, through colourful worlds filled with puzzles and challenges. The games combined platforming action with inventory-based puzzle solving, creating a hybrid that appealed to a wide audience. The series spawned numerous sequels and spin-offs, becoming one of the Spectrum's most recognizable franchises. The cheerful aesthetics and accessible gameplay made Dizzy Games family-friendly in an era when many titles were more action-focused. Sports simulations and management games also thrived. Football games like Match Day and its sequel offered simple but engaging soccer action. Daley Thompson's Decathlon and other athletics games required players to waggle the joystick or keyboard rapidly to make their athletes run faster, a control scheme that became notorious for breaking hardware. Management games like Football Manager allowed players to take control of a team, making tactical decisions and managing finances. These titles appealed to older audiences and demonstrated the Spectrum's versatility beyond action gaming. Educational software existed in abundance, though it often struggled to balance pedagogical goals with entertainment value. Math games, spelling programs, and geography quizzes attempted to make learning interactive. Some were genuinely effective, while others felt like thinly disguised lessons that children saw through immediately. The best educational software succeeded by being games first that happened to teach something, rather than teaching tools with game-like elements awkwardly grafted on. This remains a challenge in educational software design to this day. The community around Spectrum gaming extended beyond simply playing. Players would phone each other to discuss strategies, write to magazines with tips and tricks, and gather at computer clubs to compete or compare high scores. Cheat codes and pokes, values that could be entered into the Spectrum's memory to grant infinite lives or other advantages, were shared widely. Magazines would publish entire sections dedicated to pokes, creating a parallel ecosystem of game modification that presaged modern modding cultures. High-score competitions, often organized by magazines, gave competitive players a way to prove their skills. Players would photograph their screens showing their achievements and send the pictures to magazines, which would publish the top scores. This required a level of trust, as verification was difficult, but it created a sense of community and friendly competition. Some games included codes that players could note down and send in as proof of completion, adding a layer of validation to these competitions. The aesthetic of Spectrum games became distinctive, shaped by the hardware's capabilities and limitations. The color palette, the color clash, the characteristic beeper sound, and the loading screens all contributed to a visual and audio identity that was immediately recognizable. Loading screens in particular became an art form, with talented artists creating detailed images that would display while the game loaded. These screens were often the first thing players saw and set the tone for the experience to follow. Some artists, like Bob Wakelin, became well known specifically for their loading screen artwork. The ZX Spectrum's edge connector and expandability options spawned an entire industry of peripherals and add-ons. Third-party manufacturers recognized that Spectrum owners were eager to enhance their machines and willing to spend money on upgrades. This created a thriving market for hardware expansions that extended the Spectrum's capabilities in numerous directions, from improved data storage to better input methods and beyond. Sinclair itself produced several significant peripherals. The Sinclair ZX Interface 1, released in 1983, added network capabilities, a ROM cartridge slot, and connections for Sinclair's microdrive storage units. The microdrives were an alternative to cassette tape storage, using small cartridges containing an endless loop of tape that could store up to 85 kilobytes of data. While faster than cassette, Microdrives gained a reputation for unreliability, with cartridges sometimes failing and losing data. The technology never achieved widespread adoption, though it found use among enthusiasts and some commercial applications. The ZX Interface 2 was a simpler add-on that provided ROM cartridge slots and 2 joystick ports. The cartridge slot could accept pre-packaged software that loaded instantly, eliminating the waiting time associated with cassettes. However, ROM cartridges were expensive to produce, limiting the software available in this format. The joystick ports were more successful, as they allowed the use of Atari-compatible joysticks, which were widely available and more comfortable for gaming than the keyboard. The Interface 2 became a popular accessory for gamers. Third-party manufacturers produced a bewildering array of interfaces and expansions. The Kempston joystick interface became an unofficial standard, supported by most games that offered joystick control. Printers could be attached through various interfaces, allowing users to create hard copies of their programs or data. Some printers were thermal models that used heat-sensitive paper, while others were dot matrix units similar to those used with business computers. The quality varied, but the ability to print opened up applications in education and personal productivity. Disk drive interfaces represented a significant upgrade over tape storage. Companies like Disciple, Plus D, and others produced systems that allowed Spectrum users to connect standard floppy disk drives. Disks offered faster loading times, random access to data, and greater reliability than tape. For users doing serious programming or data management, disk systems were transformative. However, they were expensive, often costing as much as the Spectrum itself, which limited adoption primarily to dedicated enthusiasts and professional users. Memory expansions allowed even the 16 kilobyte model Spectrum to be upgraded to 48 kilobytes or beyond. Some expansions went further, offering 128 kilobytes or more, though software support for these extended memory configurations was limited. The expansions typically plugged into the edge connector and would pass through connections so additional peripherals could still be attached. Stacks of interfaces and expansions became common sights on well-equipped Spectrums, though this also increased the risk of connection problems and conflicts between devices. Light pens and graphics tablets offered alternative input methods for creative applications. Light pens could detect when the electron beam of a CRT television swept past their position on screen, allowing them to function as pointing devices. Graphics tablets used resistive or other technologies to track a stylus position, enabling drawing and design work. Neither became mainstream accessories, but they found niches among users interested in graphics and art. Some art and design packages specifically supported these devices, offering capabilities that were advanced for home computer software of the era. Sound synthesizers and music composition tools extended the Spectrum's audio capabilities beyond the simple beeper. Some were software-based, using clever programming techniques to generate more complex sounds from the standard hardware. Others were hardware add-ons that provided additional sound channels or synthesis capabilities. Musicians experimented with the Spectrum as an instrument, creating compositions that showcased what could be achieved. While the Spectrum never became as associated with music as some other platforms, a subculture of Spectrum musicians did develop. Communication and networking peripherals were more exotic but did exist. The ZX Interface 1 included networking capabilities that allowed multiple Spectrums to be connected together, though this feature saw little real-world use outside of some educational settings. Modems allowed connection to early online services and bulletin board systems, giving users access to remote computers and messaging systems. These technologies presaged the Internet era but remained niche during the Spectrum's peak years due to cost and complexity. The clone and compatible market also flourished. In countries outside the UK, companies produced Spectrum-compatible machines, sometimes with enhancements or variations. In the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, unauthorized clones circulated widely, as the Spectrum's relatively simple design made it feasible for local production. These clones often had different form factors or minor technical variations, but could run Spectrum software. The global spread of Spectrum clones, particularly in regions where imported Western computers were unavailable or unaffordable, extended the platform's influence far beyond what Sinclair research itself achieved. Timex, Sinclair's manufacturing partner, produced its own variations. The Timex Computer 2068, sold primarily in North America, featured improved graphics modes and better sound capabilities compared to the standard Spectrum. In some ways, it could be seen as what we might call an enhanced Spectrum, though compatibility issues meant it occupied an awkward position between being a Spectrum and being something distinct. In Portugal, Timex produced the TC2048 and other models that were more directly compatible with UK Spectrums. These regional variations contributed to a complex landscape of related but distinct platforms. The aftermarket and modification culture thrived. Users with soldering skills would add hardware mods to their Spectrums, from composite video outputs for better display quality to reset buttons for convenience. Some would replace the rubber keyboard with mechanical keys, dramatically improving the typing experience. These modifications required technical knowledge and carried risks, as mistakes could damage the machine. However, magazines published detailed instructions, and the community shared knowledge, making modifications accessible to those willing to learn. The educational impact of the ZX Spectrum was profound and lasting. Schools across the United Kingdom and beyond adopted Spectrums as tools for teaching programming and computer literacy. The machine's affordability made it possible for schools with limited budgets to acquire multiple units, setting up computer labs that gave students hands-on experience. While the BBC Micro was the official choice in many educational contexts, the Spectrum's presence in students' homes meant that learning could continue outside the classroom. Programming instruction built around the Spectrum introduced entire cohorts of students to computational thinking and problem-solving. Teachers, many of whom were learning alongside their students, would guide classes through creating simple programs in BASIC. Students would progress from displaying text on screen to creating simple games and utilities. The immediate feedback the Spectrum provided, seeing a program run immediately after writing it, made the learning process tangible and rewarding. For many, these experiences sparked lifelong interests in computing and programming. Educational software designed specifically for classroom use ranged from basic drill and practice programs to more sophisticated simulations and exploratory environments. Some programs taught mathematics through interactive problem solving. Others offered simulations of scientific concepts like gravity, circuits, or ecosystems. Language learning software helped students practice vocabulary and grammar. The quality and pedagogical soundness of these programs varied, but their availability meant teachers had options for integrating computers into diverse subject areas. In business contexts, the Spectrum found occasional use, particularly in small businesses and shops. Inventory management programs, simple accounting software, and point-of-sale systems were developed, taking advantage of the Spectrum's low cost. However, the machine's limitations became more apparent in professional settings. The rubber keyboard was unsuitable for extended data entry. The cassette storage was too slow and unreliable for serious business applications. More capable machines like the IBM PC or dedicated business computers were better suited to commercial use, though they cost significantly more. One area where Spectrums did find business use was in specialized applications, where their low cost and programmability were advantages. Some small manufacturers used Spectrums as control systems for machinery. Researchers on tight budgets employed them for data collection and analysis. Independent shops might use a Spectrum as a simple till system. These applications were never widespread, but demonstrated that with appropriate software, the Spectrum could serve practical business purposes, particularly where budget constraints made more expensive systems impractical. The Spectrum's penetration into popular culture was significant in the UK during the mid to late 1980s. Television programs featured Spectrums as props representing modern technology. Advertisements for other products would sometimes show families gathered around a Spectrum, using it as shorthand for a technologically savvy, forward-thinking household. The machine became a cultural symbol, representing both the promise of the computer age and a specific moment in British technological history. Computer magazines dedicated to the Spectrum became significant publications in their own right. Your Sinclair, which ran from 1984 to 1993, developed a distinctive voice, combining game reviews with humour, programming tips, and community features. Crash magazine, launched in 1984, featured detailed game reviews with multiple reviewers providing different perspectives, along with lavish screenshots and artwork. Sinclair User catered to a broader audience, covering hardware and productivity software alongside games. These magazines were eagerly anticipated each month, with readers poring over reviews and typing in program listings. Television coverage of computing often featured the Spectrum. The BBC's Computer Literacy Project had popularised computing through programmes that taught programming concepts, and while these often used BBC micros, Spectrum owners could follow along and adapt the lessons. News programmes covering the growing computer industry would frequently show Spectrums as examples of the home computer revolution. This media presence reinforced the Spectrum's position as the archetypal British home computer of its era. The social dynamics around Spectrum ownership were complex. Among young people, owning a Spectrum could be a source of social capital. Having the latest games, knowing programming tricks, or being able to help others with technical problems conferred status. Swapping tapes, discussing games, and sharing tips created social bonds. However, there was also tension between Spectrum owners and those who owned competing systems like the Commodore 64. Debates about which computer was superior could become heated, with loyalty to one's chosen platform running deep. The Spectrum era coincided with broader social and economic changes in the UK. The 1980s saw the decline of traditional industries and the rise of service and technology sectors. Computing was seen as a skill that could provide opportunities in this changing economy. Government initiatives promoted computer literacy, and the Spectrum's affordability made it an accessible entry point. The machine became associated with a narrative of technological progress and personal advancement through education and skill development. Looking back, the educational and cultural impact of the Spectrum arguably exceeded its technical specifications. The machine democratized access to computing in a way that had lasting consequences. Many individuals who went on to careers in software development, game design, or related fields cite the Spectrum as their introduction to programming. The culture of experimentation, learning through doing, and sharing knowledge that formed around the platform influenced how a generation approached technology. These intangible legacies may ultimately be the Spectrum's most significant contribution. As the original Spectrum succeeded in the market, Sinclair Research developed enhanced models to maintain competitiveness and address user feedback. The first significant update came with the Spectrum Plus, released in October 1984. This model retained the 48 kilobyte memory and core specifications of the original, but featured a redesigned case and a new keyboard. The Plus addressed one of the most common complaints about the original Spectrum by replacing the rubber keyboard with a more substantial plastic key system, though still not reaching the quality of mechanical keyboards on more expensive machines. The visual redesign of the Spectrum Plus gave it a more professional appearance. The new case was grey rather than black, with a more angular, business-like aesthetic. The keyboard, while still a membrane type, offered better tactile feedback and durability compared to the original rubber keys. For users who had been put off by the original keyboard, the Plus represented a meaningful improvement. However, those who already owned the original Spectrum had little reason to upgrade, as the core specifications remained unchanged. The truly significant evolution came with the Spectrum 128, launched in January 1986 in Spain and later that year in the UK. This model doubled the memory to 128 kilobytes and added significant new features. Most notably, it included an AY38910 sound chip, the same chip used in the Amstrad CPC and other computers of the era. This dedicated sound hardware could produce 3-channel music and sound effects that were vastly superior to the single-channel beeper of earlier models. The Spectrum 128 also featured a built-in cassette recorder, eliminating the need for an external tape deck. This integration made the system more self-contained and user-friendly, though it also increased the price. A heatsink was added to address overheating issues that had affected some original Spectrums. An RGB monitor output provided better display quality for those with compatible monitors. The 128 represented Sinclair's attempt to modernize the Spectrum platform while maintaining backward compatibility with the extensive library of 48 kilobyte software. The additional memory of the 128 enabled more ambitious software projects, though developer support was initially limited as the installed base of 128 models grew slowly. Some games were enhanced specifically for the 128, offering improved music and sound effects when the AY chip was detected. However, most software continued to target the 48 kilobyte standard to maximize market reach. The 128's backward compatibility meant it could run the vast existing library, but its unique features were underutilized by many developers. By the time the Spectrum 128 reached the market, Sinclair Research was in financial difficulty. The company had invested heavily in other projects, including the infamous Sinclair C5 electric vehicle, which had been a commercial disaster. The home computer market was also becoming more competitive and saturated. In April 1986, Amstrad, a British electronics company led by Alan Sugar, acquired the rights to the Spectrum line from Sinclair Research. This marked the end of Clive Sinclair's direct involvement with the platform he had created. Under Amstrad's ownership, the Spectrum line continued with new models that reflected Amstrad's design philosophy and manufacturing capabilities. The Spectrum Plus 2, released in late 1986, was essentially a rehoused Spectrum 128 in a case styled to match Amstrad's CPC range. It featured a proper spring-loaded keyboard that finally addressed the long-standing complaints about Spectrum keyboards. The built-in cassette deck remained, and the overall build quality reflected Amstrad's more conventional approach to consumer electronics. The Plus 2 was followed in 1987 by the Plus 2A and Plus 3 models. The Plus 2A was similar to the Plus 2 but with some internal changes. The Plus 3 was more significant, replacing the cassette deck with a 3-inch floppy disk drive. This brought Spectrum users into the disk age, offering faster loading times and more convenient storage. However, the 3-inch format was proprietary to Amstrad systems, rather than the more standard 3.5-inch or 5.25-inch formats used by other computers, limiting its utility and increasing media costs. These later Amstrad models had mixed reception. On one hand, they addressed many of the original Spectrum's hardware shortcomings, offering better keyboards, integrated storage, and improved build quality. On the other hand, they were more expensive than earlier models and arrived at a time when the market was shifting toward more powerful 16-bit systems like the Atari ST and Commodore Amiga. The charm and affordability that had made the original Spectrum revolutionary were diluted in these more conventional machines. Software compatibility across the Spectrum family was generally good but not perfect. The 48-kilobyte model remained the baseline that most developers targeted. Software written for the 16-kilobyte model would run on any later Spectrum. Most 48-kilobyte software would run on the 128 and Amstrad models, though some programs that use specific timing tricks or hardware quirks might have issues. The 128's additional memory and sound capabilities required specific programming to utilize, limiting the software that took full advantage of these features. The Plus 3's disk drive introduced new complications. While the hardware could run cassette-based software through emulation, software needed to be transferred to disk first, and not all programs converted successfully. Disk-specific software for the Plus 3 was limited, as developers had to weigh the market size against development effort. By the time the Plus 3 arrived, many developers were shifting focus to newer platforms, reducing the incentive to create Spectrum-specific content, let alone content targeting the smaller Plus 3 installed base. Despite these complications, the expanded Spectrum family meant the platform remained commercially available, longer than might otherwise have been the case. Amstrad continued producing Spectrum models into the early 1990s, long after competing 8-bit systems had been discontinued. This extended lifespan allowed the software library to continue growing and gave users more time to extract value from their investments. For a platform that began in 1982, remaining in production for nearly a decade was a remarkable achievement. The home computer market of the mid to late 1980s was fiercely competitive and rapidly evolving. While the Spectrum had achieved dominance in the UK, elsewhere the market landscape looked different. In the United States, the Commodore 64 reigned supreme, outselling all competitors and establishing itself as the best-selling single computer model of all time. The C64's superior sound and graphics hardware, coupled with aggressive pricing, made it formidable competition in markets where the Spectrum competed directly. The Commodore 64 featured the SID sound chip, capable of sophisticated music and sound effects that far exceeded what the Spectrum's beeper could produce. The C64's graphics system included hardware sprites and smooth scrolling capabilities, making it particularly well suited to action games. These technical advantages were significant, and in head-to-head comparisons the C64 often came out ahead. However, in the UK market, the Spectrum's earlier entry, lower price, and established software library allowed it to maintain its position. The Amstrad CPC series, introduced in 1984, represented another British competitor. Amstrad's machines came bundled with a monitor, and either a cassette or disk drive, offering a complete system at competitive prices. The CPC had comparable or superior specifications to the Spectrum in most areas, particularly sound, where it used the same AY chip that would later appear in the Spectrum 128. However, the CPC arrived after the Spectrum had established its market position, and while successful, it never overtook the Spectrum in the UK. As the 1980s progressed, a new generation of more powerful computers emerged. The Commodore Amiga and Atari ST, both based on 16-bit processors and featuring significantly more advanced graphics and sound capabilities, represented a clear step up from 8-bit machines. These systems could display thousands of colors simultaneously, produce near CD quality audio, and run more sophisticated software. They were positioned as serious computers for professionals and enthusiasts, though they were also capable gaming machines. The Amiga in particular captured the imagination of gamers and creative professionals. Its custom chipset enabled graphics and sound that seemed almost magical compared to 8-bit systems. Games on the Amiga featured smooth animation, detailed graphics, and atmospheric soundtracks. Graphics and video production software turned the Amiga into a professional tool. While expensive compared to the Spectrum, the Amiga's capabilities justified the price for many users, and as prices fell over time, it became increasingly attractive. The IBM PC and its compatibles represented yet another direction. While initially expensive and primarily business-oriented, PCs gradually became more accessible and capable as gaming platforms. VGA graphics, sound cards like the AdLib and Sound Blaster, and faster processors transformed PCs into viable gaming machines by the late 1980s. The PC's open architecture and business legitimacy gave it advantages in educational and professional contexts. As prices fell, PCs began appearing in homes alongside or instead of dedicated gaming computers. Console gaming also evolved during this period. The Nintendo Entertainment System, released in Europe in 1986, brought arcade-quality gaming to homes at a price competitive with computers. Unlike computers, which required loading games from tape or disc and dealing with compatibility issues, consoles offered immediate plug-and-play gaming. The NES's gamepad was more intuitive than keyboard or joystick controls for many game types. Nintendo's strict quality control meant games generally met certain standards, reducing the buyer's risk. The Sega Master System provided competition to Nintendo in the console space. Later, the Sega Genesis and Super Nintendo would further establish consoles as serious gaming platforms. For users primarily interested in gaming rather than programming or general computing, consoles offered compelling value. The games were often superior to their computer counterparts, loading was faster or instant, and the dedicated hardware meant consistent performance. This siphoned off some of the potential market for gaming-focused computers. In this increasingly competitive environment, the Spectrum's age began to show. Software developers had pushed the hardware to its limits, extracting performance that Sinclair's engineers might not have thought possible, but those limits were real. Games on newer platforms simply looked and sounded better. The gap in capabilities widened as 16-bit systems and advanced consoles matured. For users who had grown up with the Spectrum, the appeal of newer systems grew stronger. Economic factors also played a role in the Spectrum's declining fortunes. The cost of newer systems fell over time, making them more accessible. Parents who had bought Spectrums for their children in the early 1980s were now considering upgrades. The used market meant that 16-bit computers and consoles became affordable to budget-conscious buyers. The value proposition that had made the Spectrum revolutionary in 1982 was less compelling in 1989 when multiple options existed at various price points. Software development resources shifted toward more capable platforms. Creating cutting-edge games for the Spectrum became less attractive when the same effort could produce visually impressive Amiga or console titles that commanded higher prices and reached growing markets. Some developers maintained Spectrum support out of loyalty or because the installed base still justified it, but the platform was clearly in decline. Magazines began covering newer systems more extensively, and Spectrum content gradually diminished. Amstrad's acquisition of the Spectrum brand brought stability, but also signaled a change in the platform's trajectory. Amstrad was focused on producing competent, affordable electronics for mainstream consumers. The experimental, pioneering spirit that had characterized Sinclair's approach was replaced by a more conservative, market-driven strategy. The Amstrad Spectrum models were solid products, but they lacked the revolutionary ambition of the original. This pragmatic approach extended the platform's life, but couldn't reverse the broader market trends. By the early 1990s, the ZX Spectrum's commercial viability had effectively ended. Amstrad discontinued Spectrum production in 1992, marking the official end of the platform's 10-year commercial run. The final models lingered on shelves for a time, often heavily discounted, before disappearing from retail entirely. The ecosystem that had supported the Spectrum, from software publishers to peripheral manufacturers to dedicated magazines, gradually wound down or shifted focus to other platforms. The reasons for the Spectrum's decline were multifaceted and interconnected. Technological advancement had made the hardware obsolete by contemporary standards. The market had fragmented across multiple platforms, reducing any single system's dominance. Consumer expectations had evolved, with users demanding capabilities that the Spectrum simply couldn't provide. The generation of bedroom coders who had driven much of the software development had either moved to newer platforms or left the industry entirely. Yet the Spectrum's impact outlasted its commercial presence. The skills and experiences gained on the platform proved transferable and valuable. Programmers who had learned to optimize code to fit within tight memory constraints, to coax performance from limited hardware, and to solve problems creatively carried these abilities to new contexts. Many successful game developers, software engineers and technology entrepreneurs credit the Spectrum as their training ground. The UK games industry, which would become globally significant in subsequent decades, had roots in the Spectrum era. Companies founded by Spectrum developers grew into major publishers and studios. The culture of small team development and individual creativity that characterized Spectrum game creation influenced how British game development evolved. The willingness to experiment with unusual game concepts and to prioritize gameplay over technical spectacle can be traced back to the constraints and opportunities of the Spectrum era. Educational impacts were similarly enduring. Students who learned programming on Spectrums in schools carried computational thinking skills into their adult lives, even if they didn't pursue technology careers directly. The widespread exposure to programming demystified computers for an entire generation, making technology seem approachable and understandable rather than alien and threatening. This cultural shift had implications for how the UK approached the digital economy in later decades. The preservation of Spectrum hardware and software became a concern as the platform aged. Early computers like the Spectrum faced obsolescence not just commercially but physically. Components failed, cassettes degraded, and knowledge of repair and maintenance became scarcer. Enthusiasts began efforts to document, preserve, and archive the platform's history, recognizing that without intervention much would be lost. These preservation efforts would intensify in the Internet era. Clive Sinclair himself moved on to other ventures after the sale to Amstrad, though none achieved the success of his early computing products. His later inventions, from the C5 electric vehicle to various personal transport concepts, were often ahead of their time but commercially unsuccessful. Sinclair received a knighthood in 1983 for his contributions to British industry, recognition of the impact his affordable computers had made. When he passed away in September 2021 at age 81, tributes poured in from across the technology world, acknowledging his role in democratizing computing. The Spectrum story offers lessons about technology, markets, and innovation. The machine succeeded not because it was the most technically advanced, but because it was accessible and arrived at the right moment. It demonstrated that price and availability could outweigh raw specifications in consumer markets. It showed how limitations could foster creativity rather than stifle it. And it proved that small teams with clear vision could create products that changed industries. The platform's decline illustrated the relentless pace of technological change and the difficulty of maintaining market leadership in rapidly evolving sectors. What was revolutionary in 1982 was obsolete by 1990. Consumer expectations and competitive dynamics shifted faster than any single product line could adapt. The Spectrum's lifespan, while impressive, was ultimately bounded by these larger forces. The digital preservation of ZX Spectrum software began in earnest in the 1990s as the Internet became more accessible. Enthusiasts recognized that the cassette tapes and aging hardware that preserved Spectrum software were fragile and finite. Projects emerged to create digital archives of games and programs, converting cassette audio to digital formats and documenting the software library comprehensively. Websites like World of Spectrum became central hubs for these preservation efforts. Emulation technology allowed Spectrum software to run on modern computers. Early emulators appeared in the mid-1990s, enabling anyone with a PC to experience Spectrum software without owning original hardware. As emulation improved, these programs could accurately reproduce the Spectrum's behavior, including its quirks and limitations. Emulators became sophisticated enough to support peripheral hardware, networking features, and debugging tools that went beyond what the original hardware offered. The availability of emulators and archived software sparked renewed interest in the Spectrum among both nostalgic former owners and curious newcomers who had never experienced the original platform. People could revisit childhood favorites or discover classics they'd missed. Emulation democratized access to the Spectrum's library in ways that would have been impossible when the platform was current. A game that might have been available only through mail order in 1985 could now be downloaded and played anywhere in seconds. Hardware preservation faced different challenges. Original Spectrum computers, particularly early models, became collectible. Enthusiasts sought working examples, often having to repair or restore units that had suffered decades of neglect or use. Communities formed around restoration techniques, sharing knowledge about component replacement, common failure modes, and maintenance. Some individuals amassed collections of Spectrums and peripherals, effectively creating personal museums of the platform's history. The FPGA revolution brought new possibilities for hardware preservation. Field-programmable gate arrays allowed enthusiasts to recreate the Spectrum's hardware at a fundamental level, not through software emulation, but through hardware that functioned identically to the original silicon. Projects like the ZX Spectrum Next took this further, creating modernized spectrums with enhanced capabilities while maintaining compatibility with original software. These new machines captured the spirit of the Spectrum while addressing its limitations. The ZX Spectrum Next, launched through crowdfunding campaigns in the late 2010s, exemplified modern approaches to retro computing. This machine featured enhanced graphics and sound, more memory, SD card storage, and modern connectivity options while running Spectrum software natively. It appealed to those who wanted to experience Spectrum computing with contemporary conveniences. The success of the Next crowdfunding demonstrated that demand existed for new Spectrum-compatible hardware decades after the original's discontinuation. Homebrew software development for the Spectrum continues into the present day. Modern programmers, using contemporary development tools but targeting the original hardware specifications, create new games and applications for the platform. Annual competitions celebrate new Spectrum software, with categories for games, demos, and utilities. This ongoing development keeps the platform alive in ways beyond mere preservation, as new creative works continue to expand the Spectrum's library. The demoscene, a subculture dedicated to creating impressive audio-visual presentations on constrained hardware, has embraced the Spectrum. Demo programmers push the hardware beyond what was thought possible during its commercial era, using tricks and techniques that exploit every aspect of the system. Spectrum demos showcase effects that would have seemed impossible in 1982, demonstrating that creative programming can transcend hardware limitations. These demos are art pieces that celebrate the machine's capabilities. Social media and online communities have connected Spectrum enthusiasts globally. Forums, social media groups, and YouTube channels dedicated to the platform allow people to share memories, technical knowledge, and discoveries. This distributed community preserves oral history and institutional knowledge that might otherwise be lost. Younger participants learn about computing history directly from those who lived it, creating intergenerational connections around shared appreciation for the platform. Documentation efforts have produced comprehensive resources about the Spectrum. Books detailing its history, technical specifications, and cultural impact have been published. Visual compendiums showcase the platform's software library through carefully photographed cassette inlays and screenshots. These works serve as historical records and as celebrations of the platform's aesthetic and creative legacy. They ensure that future researchers and enthusiasts will have access to detailed information about this important computing platform. Museums have recognized the Spectrum's historical significance. Computing history museums in the UK and elsewhere include Spectrums in their collections, often with working examples that visitors can interact with. These museum exhibits contextualize the Spectrum within the broader history of personal computing and British technological innovation. For younger visitors, encountering a Spectrum provides perspective on how computing has evolved and what limitations earlier generations worked within. The commercial success of retro gaming and nostalgia products has included Spectrum-related offerings, reissues of classic games for modern platforms, compilations of Spectrum software, and documentary coverage of the platform have found audiences. While these are commercial products, they also serve preservation and educational purposes, introducing the Spectrum to people who might not seek out emulators or original hardware but who have curiosity about gaming and computing history. The ZX Spectrum's place in computing history rests on several interconnected achievements. Most fundamentally, it made computing accessible to millions who otherwise would not have been able to afford it. The pricing strategy that Sinclair pursued, while necessitating compromises in specifications and build quality, achieved the goal of mass-market penetration. This democratization had ripple effects that extended far beyond the platform itself, influencing an entire generation's relationship with technology. The cultural phenomenon of bedroom coding represented something genuinely new in the software industry. Previous computing eras had been dominated by institutions, corporations, and universities. The Spectrum era proved that individuals, often very young individuals, could create commercially viable software from their homes with minimal resources. This precedent influenced how we think about software development and entrepreneurship, validating the idea that barriers to entry could be lowered and that talent could emerge from anywhere. The technical limitations of the Spectrum forced creativity in ways that abundant resources might not have. Programmers learned to write efficient code because they had no choice. This could be interpreted as suggesting that constraints can drive innovation, pushing developers to find clever solutions rather than relying on hardware capabilities. The techniques developed on the Spectrum, from the sound synthesis methods to the graphics tricks, represented genuine innovation within tight boundaries. The Spectrum's design philosophy of minimalism and essentialism offers a counterpoint to approaches that prioritize feature completeness over accessibility. Sinclair's team made conscious decisions about what to include and what to omit, always weighing functionality against cost. This ruthless prioritization enabled the product to exist at all. We might see echoes of this philosophy in modern product design discussions about minimum viable products and essential features versus nice-to-have additions. The ecosystem that formed around the Spectrum, from magazines to user groups to software publishers, illustrated how communities could form around technology platforms. These communities were not merely consumer groups, but active participants in the platform's evolution. Users created software, hardware modifications, documentation, and support networks that extended the platform's capabilities and lifespan. This community-driven model presaged aspects of modern open source and maker cultures. The Spectrum's role in British technological history carries national significance. During a period when British manufacturing was declining, the Spectrum represented a success story in emerging technology sectors. It demonstrated that British innovation could compete globally, and that small companies could challenge established international corporations. The pride associated with the Spectrum as a British achievement reflects broader narratives about national identity and technological competence. The educational legacy touches on questions about how people learn technology and how early exposure shapes later capabilities. Many programmers and engineers who began on the Spectrum describe it as foundational to their careers. This raises interesting questions about whether similar formative experiences exist for current generations, or whether the nature of technology education has fundamentally changed. The immediate feedback and hands-on experimentation that characterize Spectrum programming may have pedagogical value that is harder to replicate with modern systems. Gender dynamics in Spectrum-era computing were complex. While the industry and user base were predominantly male, reflecting broader patterns in technology, there were women who programmed, developed games, and contributed to the community. The structural and cultural factors that shaped this gender imbalance in the 1980s offer historical context for ongoing discussions about diversity in technology. Understanding this history helps frame contemporary efforts to broaden participation. The preservation challenges facing the Spectrum and similar platforms raise broader questions about digital heritage. Software and hardware from this era exist in a precarious state. Physical media degrades, hardware fails, and the knowledge needed to maintain these systems resides with an aging population. The efforts to preserve this history through emulation, archiving, and documentation represent a race against time and entropy. The Spectrum's preservation story is part of larger conversations about how we maintain access to digital history. The Spectrum's influence on game design extends beyond the specific titles created for it. The constraints of the platform encourage certain design approaches, games that emphasized gameplay over graphics, titles that worked within the limitations creatively, and experiences that were immediately accessible but deep enough to sustain long-term engagement. Some of these design principles remain relevant in contemporary indie game development, where small teams work within resource constraints to create compelling experiences. The economic model of Spectrum software distribution, with its emphasis on affordable prices and high volume, created a different dynamic than premium pricing models. Games that cost only a few pounds needed to sell in large quantities to be profitable, but that affordability meant buyers could take chances on unknown titles. This fostered experimentation and diversity in the software library. We might draw parallels to modern app stores and digital distribution platforms where low prices and impulse purchasing create similar dynamics. The relationship between the Spectrum and television, as its display medium situated computing within domestic entertainment spaces. The computer was not something separate requiring dedicated workspace, but something that connected to the family TV. This integration into existing home infrastructure lowered psychological barriers to adoption. It positioned computing as something ordinary rather than exotic, which may have contributed to widespread acceptance. More than 4 decades after its release, the ZX Spectrum continues to inspire enthusiasm, creativity, and analysis. The platform's technical specifications are thoroughly obsolete, yet interest persists among those who remember it fondly, and those discovering it for the first time. This enduring fascination speaks to something beyond mere nostalgia, touching on the Spectrum's role as a symbol of a particular approach to technology and creativity. The modern Spectrum community demonstrates that retro computing is not simply about preserving the past, but about engaging with it actively. New software continues to be written, hardware continues to be maintained and enhanced, and knowledge continues to be shared. This living history approach treats the Spectrum not as a museum piece, but as a platform still capable of providing creative satisfaction and technical challenge. The fact that people choose to spend time with deliberately limited technology in an age of powerful devices suggests that something valuable exists in these constraints. For those who grew up with the Spectrum, returning to it through emulation or preserved hardware can be powerfully evocative. The distinctive visual style, the characteristic sounds, and the remembered experiences create emotional connections that transcend the technology itself. These memories are bound up with childhood, family, friendships, and formative experiences. The Spectrum becomes a portal to personal history, which helps explain the depth of attachment many feel toward it. Younger enthusiasts who encounter the Spectrum without nostalgia often find different value in it. For some, it represents accessible entry into retro computing and hardware hacking. The relatively simple architecture and available documentation make the Spectrum approachable for learning how computers work at a fundamental level. For others, it's an aesthetic and design object, with its distinctive appearance and cultural associations. The Spectrum has become cool in retro culture, appearing in art, music, and fashion as a symbol of 80s British technology. The lessons from the Spectrum era remain relevant to contemporary technology discussions. Questions about accessibility versus capability, the role of constraints in fostering creativity, the value of community-driven development, and the impact of technology on education and culture all have resonances today. While the specific context has changed dramatically, the underlying tensions and opportunities bear similarities. The Spectrum story offers historical perspective on challenges that remain pertinent. The platform's global reach, through official distribution and unofficial clones, meant that the Spectrum experience was shared across many countries and cultures. In Spain, the Spectrum achieved popularity second only to the UK. In the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, clones introduced computing to regions where Western machines were unavailable. Each of these markets developed its own software and culture around Spectrum-compatible machines, creating a distributed global community with local variations. The technical achievements on the Spectrum platform, particularly in later years as programmers fully exploited the hardware, demonstrated what could be accomplished within severe limitations. Games and demos that seemed impossible on the original specifications were created through deep understanding of the hardware and willingness to use unconventional techniques. This pushes back against deterministic views that hardware capabilities strictly define what can be achieved, showing instead that human creativity and effort can transcend apparent boundaries. The Spectrum's aesthetic has been preserved and celebrated in contemporary retro-inspired games and media. The characteristic color palette, the visual style shaped by technical constraints, and the overall look and feel have been deliberately recreated in modern works that seek to evoke the era. This aesthetic preservation treats the Spectrum's visual language as something valuable worth revisiting, not merely as a historical artifact but as a design choice with contemporary appeal. In educational contexts, the Spectrum and similar platforms from its era are sometimes used to teach computing history and principles. Students examining the Spectrum can see clearly how hardware and software interact, how design constraints shape products, and how technology evolves over time. The transparency of the system's operation, compared to modern computers whose complexity obscures underlying principles, makes it pedagogically valuable for certain learning objectives. The commercial afterlife of the Spectrum brand has seen various attempts to capitalize on its recognition. Some have been respectful homages that understand what made the platform special. Others have been cynical exploitation of nostalgia, with products that bear little relation to the original spirit. The distinction between celebration and exploitation reflects broader tensions in how commercial culture engages with history and memory. Looking forward, the Spectrum's preservation and celebration seem secure for the foreseeable future. The community shows no signs of disappearing. Emulation technology continues to improve, and new generations discover the platform. As long as people find value in engaging with this piece of computing history, whether for nostalgia, education, creativity, or curiosity, the Spectrum will persist beyond its physical obsolescence. The ZX Spectrum story is ultimately one of democratization, creativity, and community. A small British company created an affordable computer that reached millions, enabling them to program, play, create, and learn. From bedroom coders to commercial developers, from school children to hobbyists, diverse people found in the Spectrum a tool that empowered them. The platform fostered a culture of experimentation and sharing that influenced how an entire generation engaged with technology. These achievements, more than any technical specification, constitute the Spectrum's true legacy. The machine with the rubber keyboard and the rainbow stripe changed computing history, not through revolutionary technology, but through accessibility, timing, and the community it inspired. In doing so, it demonstrated that the most important aspects of technology platforms are often not the specifications, but the human creativity and connection they enable. The ZX Spectrum remains a testament to what becomes possible when technology becomes accessible to everyone, and that lesson endures.